Good morning. I'm going to wait a few moments as usual. All right, I'll go ahead and get started this morning with our brief background here. Good morning. It is 9:02 on September 15th, 2023. I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the 5th day of Phase 3 of the hearing in the court reference proceeding in the case of City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar, Monterey County Superior Court case number 20CV001387. This hearing, as it has been all week, is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. The audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of that recording. On that note, I think there was a note yesterday about some of the transcription files being either misdated or missing. And I think we've corrected those, or we're in the process of correcting those on our AHO FTP site. So just so you're aware. If at any time you're experiencing technical difficulties, please send us an email, admin@waterboards.ca.gov. Assisting me today is Nicole Mullen, as usual, Skylar Anderson, Kyle Woldridge, and Regina Graziano with the Office of Research Planning and Performance. I am going to once again not go over the appearances, but I will just look to the room to see if there's anyone joining us today other than our witnesses who has not yet had a chance to introduce themselves. I'm quickly scanning the room and I think I see all familiar faces. And welcome back, Mr. Neudecker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll just say now, I'll be here for the morning session. My colleague Siobhan Henry will cover the afternoon.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I think where we left things yesterday, we were ready to proceed, I believe, with Dr. Kincaid. And then we came to the conclusion also that we were going to need an additional hearing day. So I thought I'd check in on that. I don't know if you need more time to confer. And I'm not sure who to look to first. So I'm going to probably pick on Mr. Burchard because his mute is off, or maybe Mr. Osias because now he went off mute. Do either of you have any more information to speak to about a possible additional hearing day?
Yes, we've spoken with our experts, and me and Mr. Osias have spoken, and it looks like everybody is available on September 26th.
Which I believe is a Wednesday, is that right?
Tuesday, I believe.
Yeah, Tuesday, I believe.
I don't have a calendar in front of me.
Okay.
Yes, Tuesday.
Yes, it is a Tuesday.
And I believe that's one of the days that the AHO said that you were available.
Yes, as far as I know, we are available. Great. So I would propose we plan to convene on September 26th at 9 a.m. per usual, and block out your schedules to go to 5 p.m. so we have a full day. And I will put this in writing at some point in some type of, whether a notice of additional hearing day. That's probably how I'll style it. Thank you for conferring, and I am very pleased you could find a day. So that's happy news. Great. I think, is there anything else we should address before we proceed with Dr. Kincaid's summary of his direct testimony?
I don't think so.
Okay, I see Dr. Kincaid. And who should I look to? Mr. Burchard, are you going to be leading? Okay,
I'll just keep going.
You'll keep going. Okay. Dr. Kincaid, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for going off mute.
Good morning.
It's nice to see you here. If you would please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Dr. Kincaid, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. And I will hand things over to you, Mr. Burchard.
Thank you. Dr. Kincaid, Exhibit 164 is your written direct testimony. Exhibit 167, and these are Marina Coast exhibits, are the appendices to your direct testimony, A to F. Exhibit 169 is your written rebuttal testimony. Exhibit 176 is your second revised slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that is your phase 3 testimony?
Yes.
Okay, and then exhibit 177 is a designation of exhibits and figures that Mr. Lilly had requested in his July 26th order. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I would ask that Ms. Mullen pull up Marina Coast Exhibit 176, the second revised slides, and I would ask that you do the PowerPoint version, because Dr. Kincaid has, I think, some animations in the PowerPoint presentation that won't show up in the PDF.
Yes, please.
I think those PDFs just, I'm sorry, PowerPoints take a minute to load, as you know. So
Yeah.
I suspect that's what's happening.
Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And Dr. Kincaid, I will now turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. And good morning again, Ms. Kinsey. Before I jump into my presentation, though, I'd like to just give you a quick background, introduce my background, since this is the first time that I've spoken with you. In terms of education, I have a PhD I earned from the University of Wyoming in 1999.
You want to go to slide 2?
Yes, please. Yes, thank you. And I have master's and a bachelor's degree in hydrogeology and geology from the University of Florida. Before that, I've been working in the field of hydrogeology for more than 30 years and working specifically on groundwater hydrogeologic modeling for the past 25 years. I started and led a company focused on the development and evaluation of regional and sub-regional scale hydrogeologic models that I ran from 1999 to 2021. And since after that, I joined the company Shannon & Wilson, which is where I work now as the lead modeler. Some project experience that I think is relevant to my work here includes combinations of hydrostratigraphic, groundwater flow, contaminant transport, and radionuclide modeling that I've done or directed for the Department of Energy at the Yucca Mountain Project and the Nevada National Security Site. That was for about 8 years. For the Department of Defense at the Defense Supply Center, Philadelphia, for about 10 years. For the New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority at the East Side Access Project for about 4 years. For the state of Florida Geological Survey and DEP for about 10 years. For the state of Pennsylvania, Bucks County for about 3 years. Various oil and energy companies, including BP, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, and Duke Energy for about 5 years. And then supporting work for Marina Coast Water District with regards to this project since 2015. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And I just want to start like kind of a little bit of a perspective in that models are really just estimates. They are, of course, sophisticated estimates, but they're estimates nonetheless. And when different models produced by different people say the same or similar predictions, I think that those predictions are likely to have or be more reliable than predictions that are produced by only one model. Both MCWD and CalAM have produced models. They're obviously different. but they produce several similar predictions related to the probable project impacts. And these following ones are 10 that I think that both models definitively predict. Number one, that the proposed project pumping will create drawdown in the dune sand aquifer, the lower dune sand aquifer, the upper 180-foot aquifer, the lower 180-foot aquifer, and the 400-foot aquifer. Number two, that in each of those aquifers, the spatial extent of the drawdown will be larger than the capture zone for the project wells. Number three, that the proposed project pumping will increase seawater intrusion in areas outside of the capture zone that would not have occurred in the absence of the proposed pumping. Number four, that the spatial extent of that seawater intrusion will extend into the Monterey subbasin. Number five, that the increased seawater intrusion that will occur in the Monterey subbasin will cause TDS concentrations to rise by as much as 5,000 milligrams per liter at distances of more than a mile inland from the coast. Number six, that increased seawater intrusion will cause TDS increases in the Monterey subbasin and the upper 180-foot aquifer to be more than 1,000 milligrams per liter in the area around MCWD number 12, well number 12. Number seven, that the percentage of the proposed project groundwater extraction from inland sources, which can be as much as 12% of the 15.5 MGD level of extraction, will originate as fresh water recharge to the DSA that would have otherwise flowed into the upper 180-foot aquifer and then eastward to pumping wells in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Number eight, that the proposed project pumping will result in more than 10 feet of drawdown locally within the dune sand aquifer and more than half a foot of drawdown across a large portion of the DSA within the model domain. Number nine, that the lower TDS concentrations predicted to occur east of the proposed project as a consequence of the proposed pumping will be a result of induced downward leakage of fresh water or fresher water from the upper to lower aquifers and is thus a product of the drawdown in those upper units. And number 10, that the proposed groundwater extractions will cause an increase in cross-boundary flows from the Monterey to the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Can we go to slide 5, please? Thank you. Okay. Calibration, model calibration is the process of adjusting model parameters that cannot be directly measured. So we've heard lots about calibration. I thought I would just give a perspective. Parameters that cannot be directly measured include hydraulic conductivity, recharge, and the degree of hydraulic connection between an aquifer and an overlying or adjacent water body, such as a river, a lake, or an ocean. In the old days, we called that leakance. In order to match as closely as possible as time and effort allow observed conditions that would include heads, which was the primary target for calibration in this case, flows for which we had really no data, but that both parties agreed to an estimate of overall ocean inflow to try to simulate, travel times if those are available, and we didn't have any data for those, or concentration changes over time, which we did have, but that neither party has really effectively used for model calibration. So a little background on our models to respond to what you've heard from Cal-Am. On our June 12 model is a revised calibration designed to improve our simulation of ocean inflow while also correcting a mistake that was made in the translation of heads that we received from Mr. Durbin to our model boundaries. We had, when we submitted our model, we didn't realize that our model was really grossly overestimating the agreed upon target ocean inflow. We performed that work prior to running any scenarios and were therefore not influenced by any model simulation of impacts before we made those changes. Our June 18th model files used heads that we received directly from Mr. Durbin and were directed by him to apply to our boundaries for scenarios A, B, C, and D. We didn't change our calibration at that time and demonstrated that we used what Mr. Durbin provided in our previous round of testimony, yet Dr. Ye in his testimony continues to accuse us of some kind of impropriety. Cal-Am, on the other hand, with respect to their recharge sensitivity model, made their changes after running scenarios, evaluating results, and determining that lower recharge would make the model results more favorable to their position. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The totality of modeling performed to date demonstrates to me that the extent and movement of seawater intrusion and the impacts of the proposed groundwater extractions are governed by the balance between ocean inflow and freshwater flow from the DSA into the 180-foot aquifer occurring between the coast and the western margin of the SBA. OWP in the slant wells will, simulated OWP anyway, and the slant wells will go up when the DSA component of the flow goes down, and the simulated OWP in the slant wells will go down when the DSA component of that flow goes up. We really have no data to help us constrain what those flows are from either the ocean or the DSA, so we have to therefore rely on what's reasonable. So to this point, CalAm argued that the test slant well pumping test provided control on ocean inflow, yet they testified to the fact that the simulated OWP from the test slant well was very sensitive to TDS assigned to the percolation ponds. Whatever was assigned in the percolation ponds is essentially what the model simulates. That were being operated, and those percolation ponds were being operated by CMEX at the time of the test, but weren't directly measured during the test. They instead asked us to trust their estimate based on scant measurements, estimated percentages, and a video to 5 significant digits. Can we go to slide 7, please? This slide shows our conceptual model, which for a while I used to believe was a shared conceptual model. And I've identified 3 key areas on this model that I've marked with numbers. Number 1 shows the flow from the DSA over the Salinas Valley Aquitard, or sometimes described as the F Fort Ord Salinas Valley Aquitard, and into the underlying 180-foot aquifer. Number 2 identifies flow from the DSA over the SBA to the proposed slant wells. And number 3 identifies ocean inflow to the DSA and the 180-foot aquifer that in part is captured by the slant wells and in part goes around the capture zone and east in the lower 180-foot aquifer. This conceptual model is based on data. It's based on heads that are above sea level in the upper 180-foot aquifer along the coast. It's based on freshwater concentrations, or TDS, that show freshwater distributed widely throughout the upper portion of the 180-foot aquifer. And it's based on published conceptualizations. It's consistent with the conceptual models that you've already seen from Ms. Nelson's testimony that were developed in association with the Fort Ord remediation efforts. And it's also consistent with the conceptual model that was previously used by CalAm, which you can see in Mr. Leffler's testimony, CalAm 13, figure 5. Going back, taking a step back again, thinking about calibration, the overarching modeling objective from my perspective is to reasonably adhere to observed conditions. Those would be the heads or flows and travel times if we had them, or concentrations, while testing and honoring to the extent possible the conceptual model. So that's the overall objective to me of modeling. With regard to CalAm's claims about our model construction, Mr. Durbin argued that MCWD failed to honor what's known about offshore geology. But what he failed to tell you is that we don't know anything about the hydraulic conductivities, vertical or horizontal, in those aquifers offshore, and therefore don't know where they effectively become hydraulically connected to the ocean. Or again, in the parlance of the former days, we don't know what the leakage is, or the leakage is. Our approach, we did use those geologic maps, some of which that CalAm was in their testimony. Primarily, I relied on maps from a publication, Feeney 2013, to delineate the offshore parts of the hydrostratigraphic units. We assumed that the hydraulic conductivity is the same in the onshore as it is in the offshore components of the respective hydrostratigraphic units. And then we used the position of constant head boundaries to approximate the location of hydraulic connection between the units and the ocean during our calibration process. So we effectively used the position of those boundaries to calibrate the leakance, if you will, of where the ocean becomes hydraulically connected to those units. And our model honors the conceptual distribution of aquifer outcrops. They become farther as you go progressively deeper. The CalAm approach used different hydraulic conductivities assigned in the ocean to facilitate or inhibit hydraulic connection and thereby facilitate calibration. They increased vertical hydraulic conductivity by a multiplier of 20 times in the water table layer relative to the onshore component of the same aquifer to facilitate connection to the ocean, between the ocean and the underlying 180-foot aquifer. By doing that, they effectively created a pipe to drive ocean water down through layer 2 to the underlying 180-foot aquifer. For some perspective, a 20-time increase is a really big difference. I think of it as, imagine you live on the street, and if you live on the east side of the street, you make $100,000 a year. But if you live on the west side of the street, you make $2 million a year. And that's the difference 20 times gets you. The bottom line is that CalAm's model effectively establishes hydraulic connection to the ocean and the upper 180-foot aquifer very near the coast. Thus, CalAm shows very little drawdown in the upper 180-foot aquifer, which you can see on their maps due to project pumping. CalAm, by doing that, I believe they facilitated or exaggerated the ability of the ocean to deliver water to the project wells in the upper 180-foot aquifer. They effectively designed a model that maximizes OWP at the expense of conceptual reasonableness while pretending to appropriately simulate the geology that has been mapped offshore. We were also criticized for making the change at all. Why did we make that change? The model design using an explicit ocean layer, as is in the CalAm model, was originally considered important because we intended to account for equivalent freshwater heads, meaning that we originally envisioned that the ocean boundary would have been dependent on the depth of the seawater at that location. Once we decided to use constant heads or sea level as the ocean boundary condition everywhere, the more complicated design became unnecessary. Using boundary conditions the way we did, though, facilitated more model runs during our calibration effort and results in a more transparent translation of our conceptual model. Finally, and for full disclosure, we didn't focus much of our effort on the simulation of the deep aquifer. That was intentional because we think it's very unlikely that the proposed project will impact that aquifer, and quite frankly, we didn't have enough time to do everything. The calibration results and the predicted changes in conditions in the deep aquifer are irrelevant to these proceedings from my perspective. Can we go to slide number 8, please? It's the next slide. Thank you. Let's look at what happens when we reduce recharge, the CalAm's low recharge sensitivity model. So these maps show calibration residuals, or just they show numbers that compare the difference between the simulated head and the observed head at the specific wells. The blue circles or positive numbers indicate locations where the model is under predicting those heads. And the red numbers show areas where the model is over predicting those heads. The map on the left is from CalAm's original model for the upper 180-foot aquifer. And the map on the right is from their low recharge sensitivity model for the same aquifer. And if you just look at the map on the left, we can see that the original model already, our model does as well, already under predicts heads across the upper 180-foot aquifer. But reducing recharge caused those heads to fall even farther. So in other words, the numbers in the map on the right are larger, the blue numbers are larger than the blue numbers on the left. So after reducing recharge, the CalAm model underpredicts the heads in the upper 180-foot aquifer by a larger amount. And therefore, reasonably, this hypothesis of lower recharge should be considered unreasonable because it caused the simulation to deviate farther away from the observed conditions. So as it turns out, reducing recharge is not really a reasonable way to correct for the underprediction of heads. If you could go to slide 9, please. I'm just going to walk you through some of the layers so it's not isolated to the upper 180-foot aquifer. The same problem occurs in layer 2, which is their simulation of the dune sand aquifer. If you go to the next slide, please. This is the lower 180-foot aquifer, same problem, rendered the calibration worse. And then if you could go to slide 11, please, or the next slide. This just shows that it extended down into the 400-foot aquifer as well. So again, lowering recharge is not really, the model indicates that it's not reasonable. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here, this argument about recharge. Cal-Am has always argued that recharge in the DSA must be very low. In other words, that the percentage of the rainfall landing on the mound of sand that infiltrates into those sands, as opposed to running off over the land surface, evaporating or being used by plants, must be very low. In fact, about as low as what would occur in the adjacent areas that consist of considerably lower permeable materials. The effect of lower recharge to the DSA is to reduce the magnitude of freshwater flow from the DSA into the 180-foot aquifer where it can be captured by wells. And they've argued this despite the fact that specific soil water balance modeling performed by EKI suggests higher recharge. That's the recharge that we use. Lack of surface water features that would indicate that rainfall is collecting at the land surface or running off via streams instead of infiltrating into the dune sand aquifer. Or the fact that historical modeling in this area, including their own models, have consistently underpredicted heads in the 180-foot aquifer. So you might think if that our recharge values were consistently too high, that we would see that reflected in an overestimation of heads rather than an underestimation of heads. And they've been quite persistent in this regard and successfully convinced the AHO to use scenario B, which is a lower recharge scenario of our respective models, as opposed to the calibrated scenario, scenario A, as the basis for comparison. So we're already looking at impacts through the lens of lower recharge. With regard to their new, even lower recharge simulation, Dr. Ye stated that he only needed small changes in hydraulic conductivity to improve the calibration. He failed to mention that those changes happen to be in the locations of the model from which the simulated freshwater flows from the DSA to the 180-foot aquifer. Could we go to slide 12, please? I believe it's the next slide. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about drawdown. These maps are color floods showing the magnitude and the spatial extent of drawdown as predicted by MCWD on the left and Cal-Am on the right. Both of them are for the upper 180-foot aquifer, both that will be caused by project pumping at 15.5 million gallons per day, which is our scenarios 3B. Both models show a large spatial extent of drawdown that extends well beyond the capture zone. Yellow shows drawdown of between 0.2 and 0.5 feet. The first orange is between 0.5 and 1 foot. The second orange between 1 and 5 feet. The heavy orange line, or the heavy red line, I think it appears on some screens, is the drawdown line for the 0.5 foot contour from scenario C. And the black line is the half a foot contour from scenario D that I've overprinted on top of the scenario B simulation. So in one map, you can kind of see how all three scenarios depict the drawdown. And for the most part, they're pretty similar. With respect to gradients now, we've heard a lot about gradients. The only gradient relative to existing users are those from the ocean, which is the heads and the submarine portions of the aquifers, or the ocean itself to their wells. Mr. Durbin's testimony showed lots of lines and slopes and gradients. His focus was almost always on what occurs in the area emanating away from the slant wells. The lines that are provided in my written testimony simply show what both models say will happen to the critical gradients along lines perpendicular to the coast, located south of the capture zone and in the Monterey subbasin. Both models show that those gradients will become steeper as a consequence of slant well pumping. And this is because both models show that drawdown at and beneath the ocean will be less than drawdown in inland areas, which you can see on these maps. It is simple, both models show it, and the MCWD's model shows that it's a little bit worse. So to be clear, if you look at either of these two maps and you go south of the project area in the Monterey subbasin, you see that the drawdown on the map is either predicted to be 0 or in the yellow zone. And then if you draw a line to the east-southeast, which would be down gradient, you see that the drawdown gets larger, which means that the head goes down to a larger extent inland than it does at the coast, and therefore gradient gets steeper. The project pumping is not going to somehow improve seawater in the seawater intrusion situation, as has been suggested. It's going to cause drawdown outside of the capture zone that will steepen the gradient between the ocean and the inland portions of the aquifer. That's a fact, and it's clearly shown right here by both models. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please, number 13. I'm just going to step through these layers and so you can see, we're going to see widespread drawdown in the dune sand aquifer. This is what equates to a loss of storage. Can we go to the next slide, which is for layer 7? Thank you. This is what the same type of widespread drawdown in the lower 180-foot aquifer. And go to the next slide. We see widespread drawdown in the 400-foot aquifer. And now here we see one of the significant differences between MCWD's interpretation and CalAM's. And this stems from a different interpretations of the spatial extent of the aquitard that separates the separates the lower 180-foot aquifer from the 400-foot aquifer. And our model shows that aquitard pinches out as you move south into the Monterey subbasin, which was based on data. And the CalAM's model assumes that aquitard is more laterally extensive. And that's why you see these differences in the 400. Could we go to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's go to this induced seawater intrusion that's not captured. And to be clear, both models indicate that there will be more seawater intrusion outside of the capture zone as a result of slant well pumping. This table shows how much new seawater intrusion the models say will occur as a result of pumping. Reach 2, which you can see on the map, is the coastline within the Monterey subbasin. And if we use the scenario 3B, which is sort of our base, which is our base case scenario for evaluation of impacts, the MCWD indicates that increased seawater intrusion will go up by 998 acre-feet per year. And the CalAM model indicates that the increased seawater intrusion will be 752 acre-feet per year. If seawater intrusion decreases in the southern portion of the 180-foot aquifer subbasin because of capture by the project wells or within or to the east of the capture zone, those perceived benefits will not accrue to people in the Monterey subbasin. Can we go to slide 7, the next slide, please? Okay, so this is just the same thing, only it looks at the smaller scenario 2 pumping version, 11.6 million gallons per day. The model, both models indicate that the project will cause the same thing, increase seawater intrusion in the Monterey subbasin, and in this case, to increase by between 641 and 860 acre-feet per year. Can we go to the next slide, 18, I think? All right, particle tracks. Now you've heard some testimony about particle tracks. Particle tracks are exported or run actually with a separate program from the groundwater flow model, and they're exported to show what the flow model says the groundwater flow pattern is going to be like. So if we the more particles we export, the more we can see what the modeled or the simulated groundwater flow pattern is indicating. And so that's what this is. These are forward particle tracks, meaning that we seeded the coastline between the project area and the model boundary, and then asked the model to tell us where does the water go if it starts from here. And those were started along the coastline that extends from the project wells to the south. We focused on this area only because we care more about what happens in the Monterey subbasin than what happens in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin, and because running these tracks takes a fair bit of time and produces very large files. The particle tracks show ocean inflow or seawater intrusion crossing into the landward portion of the aquifer system in the upper 180-foot aquifer, which is layer 4 of the MCWD model. The colors depict the layers through which the groundwater is predicted to flow. Dark blue colors mark the dune sand aquifer, light blue, the lower dune sand aquifer, teal, the upper 180-foot aquifer, green is the lower 180-foot aquifer, purple, the 400-foot aquifer, and gray, if it shows up, is the deep aquifer. With regard to Dr. Ye's criticism about our tracks, I've highlighted the part of the impacted areas in both scenario B on the left and scenario D on the right. Those areas define the portion of the capture zone created by the slant wells. as defined by these tracks. So that's the primary impact, the capture. If we ran the no pumping scenario, that would be the primary difference. The tracks wouldn't show a capture. These particle tracks also show that nearly all of the ocean inflow is into the landward portion of the aquifers, and then northeast across the Monterey 180-foot aquifer subbasin boundary down into lower layers, where it is ultimately captured by pumping wells simulated in the model. And you can see, and I think this was already talked about in Dr. Trudell's testimony, where the path lines wrap around and become captured by the wells. In scenario 3B, the ocean inflow to the upper 180-foot aquifer is predicted to cross roughly half, the northwestern half of the Monterey 180-foot subbasin boundary, as is defined in our model. And you can kind of, that's pretty obvious. There are no tracks on the southeastern portion of that. Scenario D indicates significantly less ocean inflow and that it will cross a smaller percentage of the subbasin boundary. Some of the lines make it to the eastern model boundary, where they would presumably continue out to wells outside of the model. We can presume that these maps, I think we can presume that these maps trace the part of the flow pumped by existing users that is causing their water to become progressively more seawater intruded, right? So remember that these are just the component of flow that the model says is coming from this very specific location in the domain. Flow can be coming from lots of other places, and then mixing, as we've heard this idea of mixing zone. Well, in reality, flow is mixing all through the model because it's coming from different sources. But this would be, I think, the saline parts of those inner finger zones that Mr. Durbin described in his testimony if we look at the purple areas and get down into the 400-foot aquifer. The tracks also show that the capture zone for the slant wells gets bigger under scenario 3D, which is caused by the flattened hydraulic gradient. And going back to, way back now in this proceeding to previous testimonies and reports and studies, this is what was concluded by the Weiss studies as well. As gradient flattens, the capture zone is going to get larger. So two last points to keep in mind as we talk about particle tracks. One is that groundwater flow across the model domain does move vertically as it moves horizontally across the domain, moves vertically between the aquifers, in part due to the lack of continuity of the intervening aquitards, and in part due to slower vertical flow through those aquitards. And two, that flow in the higher aquifers is likely to provide a source of water, a source of recharge, if you will, to the underlying aquifers due to the steep downward vertical gradients that are caused by pumping in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. So just looking at these tracks again, you can see that water comes into the teal, that's the upper 180. Where you don't see the teal is where the water came in and then went immediately downward into the green, the lower 180-foot aquifer, and then ultimately into the purple, the 400-foot aquifer, as it moves to its fate or to its termination point, either at wells or the eastern model boundary. We go to the next slide, or actually to slide 21, please. Thank you. All right, these are forward particle tracks that were created using the MCWD version of the model, again, showing the upper 180-foot aquifer. This time we started them all along the boundary between the Monterey and the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. So these tracks show the fate of groundwater flow that is crossing that boundary. Again, the capture zone, which is the portion of this particular component of flow that is redirected into the wells, is shown by the red line, and it shows like a polygon. And then I even labeled it captured. And then by comparing these two maps, if you just look carefully at the map on the left and the map on the right, we can see that the project pumping will cause the pattern of groundwater flow across the basin boundary to change as well, predominantly in the area, as you might expect, closer to the capture zone. And so that I've also marked on the map. So the area where I can see changes in pattern, I labeled as pattern changed. And areas where I think the pattern is pretty much unchanged, I labeled as pattern unchanged. The model indicates that flow will be, our model indicates that flow will be to the northeast and move downward as it flows across the model domain. As in the previous set, the majority of flow is predicted to be captured by wells, and what makes it to the boundary can be expected to be captured by wells that are outside of the boundary. So here, note that not all the flow is, that all the flow is from the Monterey to the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. So these are forward particle tracks. So where they, where you don't see them is where they start. We started right on the boundary, and none of them are moving into the Monterey. Everything is moving from the Monterey to the 180. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so now we're going to step down from the DSA into the upper 180-foot aquifer. So this is flow that's crossing that boundary in the upper 180-foot aquifer. So you don't see any blue lines because none of the flow is going upward into the DSA. All of it is either in the upper 180 or, as before, dropping into progressively lower layers as it moves across the domain. It's a pretty similar pattern of flow, except that if we look in the capture zone, the flow is being pulled downward into the lower 180 where it's captured. So now what I'd like you to remember from the coastal particle tracks, that the coastal setup I showed you, it showed that the ocean inflow was only crossing about the northwestern half of the model boundary. The other half, the southeastern half, is where still flow is going across that boundary. This would be fresh water flowing across the basin boundary in the upper 180-foot aquifer, some of which I'll show you later is going to be captured by the project wells. Can we go to the next slide? And here I'm just going to go again through the layers. This is a pattern of flow in the lower 180-foot aquifer. And then the next slide, this is the pattern of flow in the 400-foot aquifer. And I'll pause for a second here. If you look in the zone and the polygon that I've labeled captured, you can see that's the green lines flow around to the wells. But then you also see that some lines in that zone flow to the northeast in a way. And what that is showing is that some of the particles that were started in the 400-foot aquifer go up into the, or pulled upward into layer 6 or into the lower 180-foot aquifer where they're captured by the wells. But some of them stay in the 400 where they evade capture and flow to the east. So it's a little hard to draw that because it's three-dimensional. But if you study that figure, you'll see that it's only the green lines, the flow that is being pulled up, that goes to the wells and it becomes captured. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so these are the same forward particle tracks that I ran from Cal-Am's version of the model. Again, we see I'm showing no pumping conditions on the left and pumping conditions on the right. These are for flow that's crossing the boundary in the dune sand aquifer. The flow patterns are simulated by the two models are pretty similar, except that the Cal-Am model shows a more easterly direction of flow, whereas the MCWD model shows a more northeasterly direction of flow. And the other big difference that I see is that the capture zone in the dune sand aquifer, as predicted by the Cal-Am model, which is labeled here on the figure on the right, is considerably larger than the capture zone that is predicted by the MCWD model. And I haven't run, but I expect that the size of the DSA capture zone would be reduced in Cal-Am's low recharge simulation. Okay, can we go to the next slide? And now I'll just scan through these again so that we can see, but this is the pattern of flow in the upper 180-foot aquifer. And go to the next slide. This is the pattern of flow in the lower 180-foot aquifer. And here we see a similar, if you look at the capture zone, you see a similar effect as was depicted for the 400-foot aquifer on the MCWD model. And if you go to the next slide, here you see no capture in the 400. And again, this is a product of the different conceptualizations of the aquitard that separates the 400 from the 180-foot aquifer. So to summarize, both models are showing cross-boundary flows that would need to be accounted for in any kind of water budget analyses that are constructed for the Monterey subbasin that would be needed to achieve and maintain sustainability. Okay, can we go to the next slide, I think, slide number 29? Yes. All right, so now let's shift gears and talk about transport, specifically what the models say about the Sigma compliance scenarios as proposed by CalAm and MCWD. These slides were constructed in the same way as those presented by Ms. Nelson and Dr. Trudell, which are also included in Ms. Nelson's testimony, MCWD 168. The model predicted impact, which is shown on the right, is calculated by subtracting the results of the no pumping scenario 1B, which is shown on the left, from the results of the, I'm sorry, not the no pumping scenario, the no Sigma implementation scenario 1B on the left, from the no pumping Sigma implementation scenario in the middle. Okay, keep it all together. And when you subtract those two, you get the result. So very similar to the impact maps that have been discussed. And as with those, with respect to these maps, yellows and reds show predicted increases in TDS, and greens show predicted decreases in TDS. And this slide shows the results from MCWD's version, or MCWD's model run for CalAm's Sigma compliance scenario, which is scenario C for the upper 180-foot aquifer. So it's really no surprise why CalAm didn't want to present these results. The green area does depict reductions in TDS occurring behind the seawater extraction wells, which are not depicted, but you can, the line between red and green is pretty obvious. But south of those extraction wells, the model predicts that seawater intrusion will sweep across the model domain, pushing the simulated TDS concentrations up by thousands of milligrams per liter within the 25-year simulation period. This is pretty much exactly what we said the simulation would do, and demonstrates that you can't pump your way out of a problem that was caused by pumping. Oddly, I think that these scenario results, though, are a more vivid way to illustrate what is happening, what I think the models say is going to happen as a consequence of the proposed project pumping. As was presented in Ms. Nelson's slides, both models show that the proposed project will, as CalAm describes, and just as is reflected here to a smaller extent, reduce seawater intrusion east of the project area, but as is depicted here, cause more seawater intrusion to advance into the aquifers north and south of the slant well capture zones, raising TDS in those areas by appreciable amounts. Before I move off the slide, I want to share my perspective on that question that you asked yesterday regarding the seawater intrusion front. Both of our models, so on this, and the reason I do it on this map is because it shows the initial conditions line, and a lot of our other maps don't. So you can see the dashed line, which is thought to be the present day conditions. And you can see that here we're showing a receding in the 1B scenario. So there's a lot of talk about this, and I think what you are interested in is it really going to happen? If so, maybe it's good news, but I don't think it's going to happen. And now as to why, these are advection dispersion models, meaning that they simulate two components of solute movement, one that accounts for the water flow, which is advection, the other that accounts for diffusion, dilution or diffusion of the solute as it moves down gradient, which is our dispersion. Our respective models simulate retreat from initial conditions because the parameter settings we're using, particularly the dispersivity, create a situation in which the solute concentrations distant from the source will break away, if you will, from the larger mass closer to the source, which is the ocean, leaving an apparently smaller plume of solute at the end of the simulation period. And if you were to export maps from each time step, which I would encourage you to do, from the transient transport simulations, you would see this happen. This whole thing has nothing to do with model layers. It has nothing to do with agency mapping. It has nothing to do with steady state or transient. It does have a little bit to do with pumping, but it has everything to do with the fact that CalAm's transport model is not calibrated to transport, and the MCWD's model is not particularly calibrated to transport either. In other words, both of us tried to use that test slant well. I don't think that's a very good calibration. I don't think it's worth classifying these models as calibrated to transport. So neither of these models are really very reliable predictors of specific future conditions. For instance, the position of the seawater intrusion front or specific concentrations at specific times for that matter. Model predictions of change are more reliable, but are still subject to uncertainties associated with their lack of calibration. Could we jump to slide 31, please? Thank you. So here's a comparison of the results from scenario C, an upper 180-foot aquifer, from MCWD model on the left, which we just looked at, and from the CalAm model on the right. The difference is, of course, the two models, but also the CalAm model is a 25-year simulation period, and CalAm model is a 64-year simulation period. Both models indicate that the dominant effect of CalAm's proposed Sigma compliance scenario is to inundate the aquifer south of the extraction wells with saline water. Can we jump to slide 35, please? Okay, so by comparison, these maps show what the two models say will happen to seawater intrusion TDS concentrations after, as a consequence of MCWD's proposed Sigma compliance scenario, which is scenario D. And that is a reduction in pumping at some wells located within the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Both of these models indicate that a roughly 30% reduction in pumping at some wells is likely to result in meeting the Sigma compliance objective, at least with respect to seawater intrusion or TDS concentrations. These maps show that the TDS changes in the upper 180-foot aquifer predicted to occur under the scenario D. MCWD, the same as before, on the left is a 25-year simulation, and CalAm on the right is a 64-year simulation. And both models indicate that the dominant effect of the MCWD's proposed Sigma compliance scenario is to vacate the aquifers of saline water. So clearly, pumping reductions, as you might expect, are a smarter response to seawater intrusion than attempting to create an extraction barrier. Can we jump to slide 39, please? Okay, so I believe everyone has now acknowledged that the uncertainty with respect to the ability of the transport models to reliably predict specific future conditions, but that they're more reliable. I think everybody's contended that they're more reliable for the prediction of the difference between with project and without project conditions. And to be clear on this point, I agree with CalAm, but I want to use this map to identify the difference between where these models predict specific future conditions and where the models are predicting changes to occur. So the specific locations of the seawater intrusion lines on these maps are examples of specific future conditions. The blue line shows where the model predicts the seawater intrusion line will be in the future without project pumping. The red line shows where the model predicts the seawater intrusion front will be in the future with project pumping. The gap between those lines, not the position of the lines, is what the model predicts will change. And the entirety of the colored area shows what the models say will change with respect to TDS. So those are the difference between changes and specifics. I bring this up because CalAm's experts, I believe, have blurred these two types of predictions. And the most striking examples are the times they point to scenario 1B or 1D, seawater intrusion line, and then say that any TDS changes predicted to occur behind the blue line or behind the predicted future position of seawater intrusion should be ignored because that area is presumed to become seawater intruding. Another example is when they point to specific simulated TDS concentrations at specific wells at specific times and assert no impact. These maps show the changes of TDS concentrations predicted to occur in the upper 180-foot aquifer by both models, 25 years on the left, 64 years on the right. Both models show that the TDS in some areas will go down, but both models also show that the TDS will go up across a large portion of the Monterey subbasin, where, to be clear, there is considerable data demonstrating that the groundwater at present is fresh and for which there have been significant financial investments made to keep it that way. Okay, so if we go to slide number 40, just step through these. Slide number 40 shows the predicted changes in TDS in the lower 180-foot aquifer. We go to next slide. Slide 41 shows Well, we could see it in tiny view. There it is. Slide 41 shows the predicted changes in TDS in the 400-foot aquifer. And if we go to the next slide, this is where finally we get to why we suffered with PowerPoint. I've got a couple of animations. I want to take a look at what the models say will happen if the project becomes active, operates for a while, and then shuts down. These animations these are animations I can't control, so I apologize for that. I can't start, stop, or rewind them. So please watch them while I'll explain, and they will rewind. So hopefully you'll get the point. The animations show the two models, MCWD on the left and CalAm on the right, and what they say will happen to TDS concentrations after different operational periods. At the MCWD model, 25 years of operation on the left, the CalAm model, 64 years of operation on the right. And then what will happen to the TDS concentrations that at the end of that operational period, and then what happens to that plume of TDS as you move forward from that point for an equivalent period of time, 25 years for the MCWD animation and 64 years for the CalAm. And we're using similar colors here to show the model predicted change in TDS concentrations from what the models say would have been there in the aquifer if there was no pumping. Orange and red show increases in TDS of between 500 and 5,000 milligrams per liter. And the greens, the darker greens, show decreases in TDS of between 1,000 and 5,000 milligrams per liter. Both models show that in the upper 180-foot aquifer, project shutdown will kick off the migration of a TDS plume that will move across the model domain and will raise TDS levels in parts of the aquifer by more than 500 milligrams per liter, and in some areas by more than 1,000 milligrams per liter. The dots depicted on these maps are all the wells that are simulated in the respective models. Some of these wells were assigned by both the MCWD and CalAm model to be pumping from the upper 180-foot aquifer, some from the lower 180-foot aquifer, and some from the 400-foot aquifer. The different pumping assignments in the respective models is based on where our respective layers are located relative to the elevations that were provided by Mr. Durbin. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please, slide number 43. All right, so now these animations show the same aquifer, the same basic setup, only now we're showing the scenario D. So what happens if these are all hypothetical. We hypothetically initiate the Sigma compliance scenario and it works, and then we turn the project on and then we see what happens. It does the same as the others, that it causes TDS to move into the aquifer. And then once the project shuts down, we say what happens to that plume of TDS. And under scenario D, we can expect the impacts to be worse, meaning that the TDS levels that are moving across the domain are higher because under scenario D, the pre-project TDS levels are expected to have become lower. So Mr. Leffler describes these predicted impacts as speculative, apparently because of time. But in other words, uniquely speculative relative to the other model speculations, uniquely because of time. But the bottom line is that these animations show what the models say, that the plume of seawater that within the slant well capture zone will be released from capture when the project stops, and then that plume will move across the basin, raising TDS along the way. The timing of that movement is certainly uncertain, but that it will happen and that it will begin as soon as the project starts is very certain. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so for this slide, well, set the stage, this slide shows the impact to TDS concentrations as depicted by the CalAm model after 64 years of operations under scenario B. So we've seen this before. This is scenario B3 minus B1. And I'm going to use this slide to talk a bit about what I think of as a cost-benefit analysis. We've heard CalAm describe the project as quote unquote beneficial to water quality in the subbasins, and have identified areas on the map where these benefits are purported to accrue. So, and they're labeled with numbers. So number one shows one of these perceived benefits, which is the seaward shift and the seawater intrusion front. east of the project area. And both models do show that the seawater intrusion front is expected to move seaward. But the models also show that the cost of this perceived benefit is the landward shift in the seawater intrusion front within the Monterey subbasin. That's number 2. Number 3 shows that another perceived benefit, which is the reduction in TDS concentrations immediately east of the project area. And the cost of that perceived benefit is drawdown and loss of storage in the dune sand aquifer, created because the slant well pumping will increase flow from the DSA into the 180-foot aquifer, where it will reduce TDS concentrations before being captured. And then area number 4 shows another perceived benefit, which is an apparent freshening behind the seawater intrusion front. The cost of that perceived benefit will be reduced protective heads in the upper 180-foot aquifer. Can we go to slide number 45, please, or next slide? Thank you. Okay, so this slide provides a 3-dimensional view of the hydrostratigraphic framework, the bones, I like that as Mr. Tietze described it in his testimony yesterday, of the MCWD model. Everything shown has been stretched vertically 10 times, vertical exaggeration of 10 times to facilitate seeing it. I'm depicting the aquatards in brown that separate the aquifers, which other than for the 900-foot aquifer, I've rendered transparent. So the space between the brown, you have to use your imagination, is the aquifers. I'm also showing a subset of the forward and reverse particle tracks. This will get a little complicated, that we ran from the margin, the western margin of the SBA, to show where the groundwater comes from and where it goes as it crosses a hypothetical plane projected vertically through the model domain along the western margin of the SBA. The tracks, again, are colored by the layer that they're flowing through. It's using the same colors that I showed before. The simulated flow paths are shown relative to the location and approximate orientation of the slant wells, which are the red line, and a wedge of ocean sitting above the submarine portions of the aquifers, which again are rendered transparent. So that's the little green piece of pie that has the ocean in it. It's difficult to show everything I'd like to and perfectly on a single perspective view. So please note that the particle tracks, they move in and out of the plane of view, which means that in some places they look like they're above or not in a unit when in fact they really are within it. The graphic shows the source and fate of groundwater flow that crosses that vertical projection of the western margin of the SVA. The groundwater depicted by the path lines is flowing from the higher elevations in the dune sand aquifer, generally westward over the top of the SVA until it reaches the margin or the edge of the aquitard, where it drops downward into the upper 180-foot aquifer and then turns and flows east. The groundwater flow paths here are for the no pumping version, scenario 1B. Can we go to slide 46? Thank you. And the next slide. This slide shows the same thing, but now we're looking at the tracks exported from scenario 3B, which is the flow that includes flow that goes to the wells. Otherwise, the pattern is pretty similar. Flow comes from the DSA off over top of the SVA, drops down. Some of that is captured and goes to the wells. The rest of it turns and goes east towards other wells in the basin. So again, this slide only shows the fate of groundwater flow that crosses that vertical projection of the SVA boundary, in this case in layer, as it's crossing in layer 1, the dune sand aquifer. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? All right, now this slide is an animation that shows the movement. It's going to show the movement of groundwater along the flow lines, which was created by printing an image from the model at every time step in the particle tracking file to show the position of the groundwater along the flow path at that particular time step. So if you could just click on the image, I think it will cause the animation to run, please. Yeah, just there you go. That's great. Okay, so this is from the no pumping scenario, and it shows what we talked about. In this case, the colors of the points depict the time step. Purples and blues are earlier time steps, lighter blues and greens are later time steps. And we can see that flow moves all the way across the model domain during the animation period, and that the majority of the lines don't make it to the end. I don't have all the wells in this view, all the other wells, the other pumping wells in this view, but the model indicates that the flow that doesn't make it to the end is the flow that's captured by those wells. Could you go to the next slide? Advance to the next slide, please. So there we go. All right, so now this is also an animation. This time we're going to look at the pumping version. So go ahead and click that, if you will, so that we can start the animation. And here we can see that the slant wells are going to capture some of the water from the DSA, and that this captured water constitutes the fastest flow in this area. The flow that isn't captured slows down considerably, and in fact doesn't make it across the model domain within the animation period. This is the cost of the flatter hydraulic gradient east of the capture zone that has been described as a benefit that will accrue to the basin as a result of project pumping. In reality, the result of slant well pumping will be less and slower flow of fresh water from the DSA into the underlying 180-foot aquifer into the existing users in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. And the flow that they used to get from this source, what they will have to get from another source, because they're going to continue to pump at the same rate. So once again, if you could just run the animation, I just want to emphasize that you see the flow goes fast to the wells. The animation is still running, and these are time step pictures that are just showing no movement of flow. And that's really is moving. It's just moving so slowly that you can't depict it until finally it breaks away from the capture zone and then becomes once again subject to the increasing gradient. Okay, if we could go to slide 52, please. Okay, these slides show the same thing, only considerably more complicated and less fun to look at. But I want to walk you through them because they constitute about 90 pages of appendices, figures in my written testimony, and this is my only chance to provide an explanation. So they show the same thing. These sets of images are like the ones they're showing, depict the source of groundwater flow that crosses the vertical plane projected upward from the western margin of the SPA, which is the black line. So the animation that you just saw was a thin piece of this because it would be so hard to show in 3D. So this is more of the domain particle tracks, but it's the same, the files are the same. These are reverse particle tracks started along the black line. So they show where the water comes from when it hits that black line. Blue arrows are showing flow to the west, which in this case is fresh water from the DSA. Red arrows show flow from the east, which in this case is ocean inflow. There is a different set for each aquifer, and these are for the upper 180-foot aquifer, and for each model, MCWD is always shown on the left and CalAm always shown on the right. Here we can see that at the SBA boundary in the upper 180-foot aquifer, the groundwater is a mixture of ocean inflow and fresh water that came from the DSA to the east. Can you go to slide 50, the next slide, please? Okay, so now this is the other half of the particle tracks that were shown in the animation. So these are the forward particle tracks that are started along the black line. So now we track the water reaching the black line, and then the particles stop. Well, they were started there. And then here we're doing forward particle tracks from the same point to show where it goes. So in this case, the blue arrows show flow to the west, which is fresh water from the DSA. And the red arrows show flow to the east, which in this case is a mixture of ocean inflow. We saw the ocean inflow coming in here on the previous set, and fresh water coming from the DSA. So here we can see that at the SBA boundary in the upper 180-foot aquifer, the majority of the groundwater is flowing to the east, and that the only flow to the west is the flow that is going to be captured by the slant wells. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, there's been argument about travel time. So with regard to travel time, As I've said, groundwater models are really just sophisticated estimates. Now, and we ask the model lots of questions, but every time, every one of the estimates, every one of the predictions, every one of the questions we ask carries with it a level of uncertainty. All of the predictions ultimately stem from the model's simulation of heads and head changes that will occur in response to some change in condition, which in this case is only the slant well, so the addition of the slant well pumping. So the farther away or the farther down field, so to speak, we get from that original prediction of change in head, the larger the uncertainty in the answer. And this is because every new question carries with it more and different assumptions regarding parameters that cannot be measured in the field, such as porosity, effective porosity, dispersivity, etc. So the uncertainty with respect to the travel time is larger than the uncertainty with respect to drawdown as a whole. And time again throughout the history of groundwater modeling, we have found that we tend to greatly underpredict travel time, which is because the rate of flow of water contaminants through the subsurface is dominated by the relatively smaller number of high flow pathways that typically evade our ability to be characterized in the field. And that's my long way of saying that we should be looking at and considering the full length of the simulated paths and not give a lot of weight to the various forms of model predicted travel times as a way to cut off our assessment of what should or shouldn't be or what will or won't happen. Because in that regard, we just don't know. We do know that there will be slow vectors of flow and fast vectors of flow. We go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now let's go back to the primary form of groundwater model prediction, the thing for which the groundwater model was designed to really do, which is measure change in head, and in this case, due to pumping, which we can also describe as drawdown. So in the next set of slides, I'm presenting a very appropriate way of looking at the probable project impacts in a way that cuts through all of, or a lot of anyway, the model uncertainties. In these slides, I showed two sets of maps, 4 in total. Each set contains 2 color flood maps. In each set, the left map depicts the real world groundwater surface in the upper 180-foot aquifer as it could be defined from the groundwater elevation measurements collected from wells and interpreted contours, both of which are shown as the black dots on those maps. So the leftmost map on both sets is identical. And in this case, that map is shown for in each set, it's going to be for a specific time period, and in this set, it's for spring of 2021. The blue colors show the groundwater elevations that are higher than mean sea level, which is 2.97 feet. Yellow is the first foot below sea level, and the reds show areas where the groundwater surface is progressively farther below sea level. So again, the leftmost map is what we believe the world to really be in the spring of 2021. The blue area shows what we describe and what we've always been talking about as protective head, which is protective simply because it's above sea level and thereby inhibits or prevents the movement of seawater from the submarine portions of the aquifer inland. In the Monterey subbasin, the blue area creates a dam of sorts that is not simulated or hypothesized. It's not an artifact of analytical or numerical modeling. It actually exists, and it is the thing that blocks seawater from moving inland and then potentially flowing down gradient to MCWD's wells. The map on the right of each set shows what that same dam or mound or groundwater surface, if you will, would have looked like in that respective time period if the slant wells had been operating and pumping for a long enough period of time for the steady state drawdown predicted by the models to have occurred. The set of maps on the left show what the MCWD model predicts the dam would have, how the dam would have diminished, and the set of maps on the right show how the CalAm model depicts that dam would have diminished. And I challenge you to find, dramatic differences. So there are a little differences, but the models show the same thing. The simulated reduction in the blue mound is the change that we're very concerned about and the change that both models predict will occur as a result of drawdown. Can we go to slide 56? The next slide, please. Okay, CalAm has accused me of cherry picking the spring 2021 data set. So I decided to cherry pick a few more. This one is analysis performed for the fall of 2021 data. And giant surprise, the dam gets smaller. Can we go to slide 57, please? The next slide. This is the same analysis for the spring of 2022. Groundwater elevation map on the left, as it would have looked like with drawdown on the right. The dam gets smaller. You go to the next slide. This is the same analysis done for the data received for August of 2022. The dam gets smaller. In August of 2022, the dam was pretty small already. So getting smaller is not really good. And then if we go to the next slide, there was a lot of discussion you heard about data not received and requested. This is what it was for. Wanted to plot a map, and if we'd have gotten that data, you would have seen the spring of 2023 heads, and we would have seen, I believe, that the dam would have gotten smaller. We go to the next slide. And wrapping up, there are inescapable effects of the project in the Monterey Subbasin. At least 4 of these include the loss of protective heads, increased seawater intrusion, increased cross-boundary flows, and a reduction in the available fresh water for existing users. Go to the next slide. Last summary. CalAm wants us to believe, they want you to believe in particular, that this area is somehow special and complicated, but it's not really that special, and it's not really that complicated. It's pretty typical of a heterogeneous aquifer that's subject to pumping and seawater intrusion. There's a big pile of sand with no drainage features or ponds. It recharges a water table aquifer. The water table aquifer delivers flow to the upper 180 foot, the upper portion, whether you want to call it a different aquifer or a zone, it doesn't matter. It delivers fresh water to the upper portion of that aquifer that has inland heads that are lowered below sea level due to pumping. Recharge from the DSA is therefore the only reason that the western part of the upper 180 foot aquifer is fresh and can deliver fresh water to MCWD wells. CalAm slant wells will take some of that fresh water. Taking that water will induce seawater intrusion outside of the capture zone. Taking that water will reduce the mound of protected freshwater heads that exist along the coast in the upper 180 foot aquifer. And existing users, including MCWD, which is, I made a mistake, should say MCWD, not CalAm, will be at increased risk of seawater, not sweater intrusion because of CalAm's project. And with that, I will conclude my testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Kincaid. I don't think I have any questions right now. I just asked, asked my team whether they had any questions, but I will look to them on the online here. Mr. Wooldridge or Ms. Graziano, do you have any questions for Dr. Kincaid at this point?
Nothing at this moment.
Okay.
Quick question on slide 29.
Ms. Mullen, can we pull up slide 29, please?
And I was typing quickly, but I want to make sure I captured everything you said. So you discuss how the model, both models for CalAm and Marina show seawater front receding after time. And your belief is it's because the initial slant well concentrations were incorrect, but you also said something about maybe your dispersivity input values should be different. I was wondering how first you all calculated your dispersivity value and what you used and how you would change it.
So there's a lot in that question. So first, if we look at the dashed line, let's look at the map on the left only, if we can. So maybe even just kind of blow up on that, or not necessary, just everybody focus on the map on the left. The dashed line are the initial conditions. And I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, it's a contour from data. So there's always uncertainty with respect to contour lines, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the contour. And I think there's been testimony about how the initial conditions are translated into the transport model. I think Dr. Trudell gave a real good explanation of that. The question then is the blue line is the simulation of, without project pumping, what happens to that same TDS concentration after 25 years. So now, I think everybody is of the thought that, seawater is slowly advancing, or seawater intrusion is slowly advancing into the basin. So when you look at this and you see, areas where the blue line has gone eastward of the seawater of that initial concentration line, it's consistent with what we tend to fear is happening, and certainly is what the agency has shown has been happening over time. When the blue line is westward of that line, it of course indicates that the seawater intrusion is receding in those locations. And depending on which model and which layer you look at, it can appear to have been receding quite a bit. So that's what we're really talking about. So I don't think, there was some question about whether, did CALAM use the right initial conditions, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But this is a process question. It's a process question. It's not a question about the agent validity of the maps or anything. It has to do with the transport model and what the how the transport model works. So the source, ultimately, the constant source through time is the ocean. So we say that, that we don't think the ocean's ever going to get any fresher. That's a different argument, if you want to take into that. But we're going to assume that it stays the same through time, but that the TDS concentrations inland, that's not a source, and those are subject to change. So there's this big giant source of constant TDS that's over there on the left. And then there's the TDS that bleeds off of that, or is moving away from that, to the right. And that movement is a function of water flow. So if there's an eastward gradient and groundwater really is flowing from the ocean, it of course is going to carry seawater, higher TDS concentrations with it. That's the advection part. And then of course you'll have a concentration gradient, because you'll have lower concentrations on one side of the line and higher concentrations on the other. And Mr. Tietze explained that really well in his testimony. And you'll have this diffusion that takes place from the higher concentrations to the lower concentrations. And that's the act of diffusing along the advection pathway is what we call dispersion. And we can't measure that. We can guess at it, like we can go to places like those contaminant plumes, and we can look for places where we can measure concentration changes through time. And we can use those changes through time to arrive at estimates of the dispersivity, but that was not done here. And loads of people have taken all kinds of different things into the laboratory and look at, laboratory settings and try to get things. And then they can publish those values into books, which they have. And then people like us can take those values and take one that we think is reasonable and plug it in. Thus, it's a guess. And so I don't know how CalAm did theirs. I presume they did it similar to what I just described. But that is a typical way to go to the textbooks when you don't have actual field data or field testing to try to arrive at that. And you plug in a value that you think is appropriate based on the different materials and based on the history of what people behind us or before us have done to look at those materials. But nonetheless, it's a parameter that can't be directly measured in the field. And that's what we talk about when we talk about calibration. So really what we talk about when we talk about, we're going to calibrate the calibrate the model with respect to transport. From my perspective, there's two components wrapped up in that. One, the primary one from my perspective would be to use known and measured travel times of hopefully as conservative types of species as possible, to estimate travel times and then calibrate your flow model to those travel times. And in some cases, there are people do age dating and but you can do dye tracing, but you can also use contaminant movement that is mapped for other reasons to get at that. So you would, if you do that, you're calibrating your flow model to observable transport or observed transport vector. And then the other thing would be to go to the transport model and then try to calibrate your transport specific settings, such as dispersivity is one of those settings. And you would try to determine a reasonable value. So you'd have your book value, if you will, to start with. And then you would do through a calibration to a plume movement, or if it was done really well and not really connected, you could have looked at the test slant well issue. And in other words, if you have this measure of concentration changes through time that you know and you know pretty well and you know are really controlled, then you can calibrate your model dispersivity to that observed data set. The problem with the test slant well is that the pumping test, was directly impacted by the percolation pond. They were in fact connected to each other. So what happens in the percolation pond is controlling what was happening in the test. And in reality, that should invalidate the pumping test. But we live in a world, we all live in a world where we have to deal with imperfect data all the time. So the fact that, this is the best test that we could get is not necessarily non-standard. But what isn't really very good is the fact that there wasn't really rigorous data measured from those percolation ponds during the test slant well operation. So because we don't really have a good handle on how much water was actually getting into the ground and what the TDS level was actually getting into the ground, the pumping test, if you will, is going to have a signal. It's going to have drawdown and changes in TDS. And we know that those signals are affected by, one, the aquifer's ability to transmit water, which is what the test is designed to do for drawdown, but it's also affected by how much water is going into the test slant well. And if we can't really constrain at least the one from the percolation ponds with really rigorous data, then we're really just guessing as to how much of the signal is due to the test slant well, to the percolation ponds, to the CMEX operation, and how much is due to the actual aquifer behavior. And then the other, with respect to the TDS, the whole idea is to say, I'm going to turn the test slant well, and I presume that the TDS change is due to ocean inflow, therefore provides a measure of ocean water percentage. But if it's also caused by TDS or water that's being pumped into the percolation pond, then once again, we have a signal conflict. We know that the change in TDS is due to a combination of both of those things, ocean inflow and the percolation ponds. And we have to be able to weed out those two different things. So with respect to the retreat of this, it demonstrates, in my mind, that we are not calibrated, right? So one of the things that we both could have done was, we could have done and we didn't, is at least we could have kept running transport simulations until at 25 years, we at least didn't get a retreat. We at least got something that was the same. That would be consistent with expectation. I don't know that it would be necessarily any more rigorous, but at least it would be consistent with expectation. But neither of us did that. So now we live with this obvious demonstration of uncertainty is really what that boils down to. So I apologize if I was long-winded. I hope I gave you the answer.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kincaid. I believe at this point, certainly what I'd like to do is take a break, and then we would pick up, because we've now heard from MCWDs and the cities witnesses, then I believe the next step would be to pick up with cross-examination. And I don't know if, is that you, Mr. Osias? Are you taking the lead?
Yes,
Wonderful.
says with enthusiasm.
Is there anything else we should talk about? I was thinking a 15-minute break would be appropriate. Anything we should address? All right, let's break until 10:45. I will see you then.
Thank you.
Your cameras are on.
Hello, everyone. I see Dr. Kincaid, but I don't yet see Mr. Osias. I think he's a key player here, so we'll give him. Oh, did he just? He moved. There, you now magically entered through. I don't know where exactly how it works, but there you are. That's okay. I will hand things over to you, Mr. Osias. You may begin your cross-examination, and I don't know what order you want to go in, but I think you get to pick. So
Thank
please let us
you.
know.
I'd like to start with Mr. Titsa.
Okay, wonderful. Here I am.
Thank you. And did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you very much.
Oh, you bet. I have that same experience. Now my view changed, so pardon me while I readjust my,
I think we're pinning the relevant.
okay. But it pinned me, and the last person I want to see is me, so. And I won't ask anyone else their opinion. So, Mr. Titsa, I don't believe we've ever met before. Is that your?
I don't recall ever meeting you. So,
Okay. So nice to meet you.
yeah, pleasure.
And perhaps more relevant than whether we actually have met or not. We haven't had the chance to depose you in any matter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Nor have you produced any documents to us in connection with the lawsuit that generated this proceeding, correct?
Not in this proceeding, no.
Okay. And so I apologize, but it was a part of a dialogue that you weren't perhaps privy to, but in response to motions we filed in argument, Ms. Kinsey suggested rather than take a deposition, we might use some of our time with you to explore those sort of things. So I intend to do that.
Okay.
So let me start with the name of your firm is what?
It's Formation Environmental LLC.
Okay. And are you an owner,
No.
employee?
Yes.
And could you tell us how big it is? By that, I mean
It's
employees
between-
or something, however you would want to do that.
I don't have an exact head count for you, but I know currently it's between 80 and 100 people. Our main offices are in Sacramento and Boulder, and we have smaller offices in Southern California, in Portland, and in Idaho, and then employees scattered at various locations that work remotely.
All right. And does your, sorry, start over. I believe I read, and you can correct me every time I make a mistake, or ask me to go look something up. But I believe I read that you've been assisting the city of Marina since 2017.
That's correct. In 2019, I was asked to put the GSP together, and that was the first item that I mentioned that I felt was directly relevant to this testimony.
Okay. But you did start working in 2017.
That's correct.
Okay. And are they, and so I need to be precise sometimes, and actually, because this is going to take some time. When questions can be shortly answered, that'd be great, because there's going to be follow-up, and then there's going to be a chance for redirect, et cetera.
I understand.
Okay. Actually, you've been deposed before, I suppose, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you sort of know how this goes. The city is, I guess, technically the client of your firm. Is that right?
That's
you-
correct. And in this matter, I have a retention from the city's council,
Oh, okay.
but on behalf of the city.
What's the date of that retention?
I don't recall precisely. I think it's around about June of this year.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But I just want to get some preliminaries out of the way. And at your firm, are you the person who provides the most assistance to this city?
That's correct. Yes.
Is it okay if I refer to them as the city, just so we don't get confused with Marina and Marina Coast Water District?
That's fine. I understand you mean the city of Marina.
Thank you. And does your compensation depend in part on keeping and retaining clients?
There is performance compensation at the end of the year, depending on the performance of the firm and of the employee. So that's decided by the partner group on the general basis of those two criteria.
Okay, so if they're a significant firm client, there's certainly a reward system that would kick in if you can keep them happy. Is that right?
As with any company, my responsibility is both the development of our capability as well as development and maintenance of our business with the clients. Yes. As with any consultancy.
Thank you. And I just did something that I do not want to do. So if I interrupt you, just remind me I'm interrupting and you hadn't finished.
No, my apologies. It just, the thoughts followed on. So
okay. Sometimes when people pause, I think they're done, but they're thinking. So that'll happen occasionally, and I'll try to avoid that. In June, you said June, you were retained for this matter. That was June of 2023.
That would have been 2023, and I would have to go back to our records to see what the exact date was, Mr. Asias. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I do know that it occurred after the variable density model was put into evidence. And I do recall that it occurred after phase 3 of these proceedings was added. So those are my clear recollections. As to what the exact date was, I can't recall as I sit here.
So I believe you said you were retained by counsel. Who was that?
That would have been Shartsis Freeze. Mr. Skip Spalding.
Right. And were you retained in writing?
Yes, we have a retention letter.
Okay. Have you provided us a copy of that?
I have not provided a copy to anyone. It's in our records.
Do you recall if that retention letter identifies the task or tasks that you are to undertake?
I believe so. Again, I would have to look at the retention letter, but my assignment was very clear. It was related to CalAm exhibits 175 and 178. And reviewing and commenting on the development and the use of a variable density flow model, including its parent model, what we refer to as the SWIM, and then the update of that model by Mr. Leffler.
So that's pretty good retention. Does it say all that in the letter?
As I sit here, I would have to verify that.
Okay. So maybe that's what you came to understand your assignment to be.
I don't think I came to understand it. My assignment was very clear from the beginning, but I can't verify for you what the exact words are in the agreement without looking at it.
All right. When's the last time you looked at it?
Oh, it's been a couple of months ago.
In connection with your assignment, were you given, I assume you were given the exhibit 175 and 178 to look at. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And what else were you given?
I'd have to go through my records precisely. I mean, we requested some exhibits that were put into evidence by Marina Coast Water District. We were provided some testimony by Dr. Kincaid. And I could provide a list, but from my memory now, I can't remember exactly what they were. But those were the additional exhibits that we had requested and were provided by way of background.
Okay. And as best you can recall, were your requests for documents in writing? Or
There were some.
Did we lose Mr. Tizza?
Looks like he's frozen.
I think we lost Mr. Tizza. Let's wait a minute or two. If he doesn't reconnect, we'll take a break, and maybe Mr. Spalding, you can see if you can make contact.
I will.
I know it wasn't that question.
Almost our first technical obstacle all week, so we've been doing very well.
It looks like everybody else is good, so assume it's at his end.
You're on mute, Skip.
Yeah.
Sometimes the space is the space bar. There we go.
There we are. Got it. I spoke to Mr. Tizza. He's having a computer issue. He'll be back on in 3 to 4 minutes, and he apologizes.
Understood. Let's go ahead and just take a 5-minute break so we can turn our cameras off, and we can use this time for whatever we need to do. And then we'll come back at 11:04, and hopefully Mr. Tizza will be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Kincaid, you can turn your camera off. There you go.
I got it.
All right, it looks like we can get started. Welcome back, Mr. Titsa.
My apologies. I'd like to say it was an act of God, but I think it was something other than that. So
That's okay. I understand. With that, I will turn things back to you, Mr. Osias.
Thank you. So I believe you were in the midst of, or were close to completing the answer to my question of what did you request?
right, your specific question, as I recall it, was, did we request any information or documents, or did we request any documents, and how was that recorded? How was that done? I believe that most of the document requests were via internet message or text message to Mr. Spalding. I don't recall if there were any email requests. And those were for specific exhibits regarding the testimonies of Ms. Vera Nelson. And we received also some information regarding Dr. Kincaid's testimony and Dr. Trudell's testimony.
Thank you. You used the pronoun we.
Yes.
Can you define for us who we is?
What I meant in that statement is I was supported in my review of the swim and the updated swim by several individuals from our firm, and we worked together to complete that review. And sometimes the requests came from me, and sometimes the requests came from Pete Townsend, who is a senior modeler in our firm.
So you realize, of course, I wanted to ask who, just to give a bad dad joke.
I get it.
And I'm not going to do that. So he
is not the lead guitarist for The Who.
Thank you.
He's a rock star in his own right, but he's not with the band that we're thinking of.
Okay, so is he the only one, or could you just give me a list of the names from your shop that were on your team?
The people who supported me were Peter Townsend, Will Nesda, and Christina Johnson.
Okay.
And all three of them are hydrogeologists.
I see. And if Mr. Townsend is a senior modeler, do you have a title like that or some other title?
His title actually, I believe, is senior hydrogeologist, and he's a partner in the firm. I am a senior hydrogeologist and engineering geologist.
Okay, thank you. Did you request what we, at least in the proceeding, have been calling the regional model prepared by Mr. Durbin?
No, we did not.
Did you request the MCWD WBSSM 2023 local model?
No, we did not.
When I use that acronym, do you know what I'm referring to?
I believe so. It's sort of unforgettable once you've seen it, and I believe you're referring to the model that was recently constructed for this proceeding by under contract to MCWD.
That's correct. And then there's
Thank you.
Another local model prepared by CalAm experts called the CalAm WBSSM 2023. You didn't request that model either.
No, that was outside the scope of my assignment.
Okay. So I take it that means you have not reviewed those models.
That's correct.
Okay. Nor have you reviewed either reports or TM's technical memorandum regarding those models.
No, we have not.
Nor did you review the testimony of the preparers of those models? Well, I take that back because you obviously got some materials regarding Dr. Kincaid, who's an author of one of those models. So I withdraw that question. Let me be a little more specific. are the materials that your team requested solely with respect to variable density modeling?
They were all requested with that objective in mind. There is obviously in any groundwater modeling undertaken some overlap between groundwater flow, solute transport, and variable density flow, so they don't all fit in their neat little cubby holes. And the reason for the requests and the review of testimony by Dr. Trudell, Ms. Vera Nelson, and Dr. Kincaid was to provide a perspective and additional information that would help us with the hydrogeologic setting of the proceeding.
So I don't want to, I will not go through all the other major documents in this case and testimonies, but because I think the answer is going to be no. But have you identified, as best you can recall, all the documents you wanted and received to complete your task?
So the ones that we did not have in our possession, I've identified for you. And we were interested specifically in the work that Ms. Nelson and her team had done in reviewing the SWIM, because they had also reviewed the SWIM in their capacity of being represented on the Groundwater Technical Advisory Committee.
And my inquiry before had been regarding documents you requested, but you had some documents presumably already in your possession, so you didn't need to request them. And so now I'm going to ask you if you could identify what materials you considered in putting together your rebuttal testimony and figures for this matter.
The documents that we considered were the Marina GSA Groundwater Sustainability Plan, volumes 1 and 2. And the work by Rosemary Knight, Dr. Rosemary Knight and her team from Stanford, and specifically the 2018 report by Gottschalk et al. And we did look at and utilize, I believe it was a 2016 report by Hopkins that included data that we had in our possession from reports prepared by Geoscience Support Services regarding 2016 sampling and groundwater level measurements in the Cal-Am monitoring wells.
Are you finished?
Yes.
Are you aware that Cal-Am experts, also collectively often called the HWG, prepared a critique of Dr. I've forgotten her name from Stanford as well?
Yes.
And when you say yes, you're aware that they prepared a critique?
Yes, I'm aware that they've prepared a critique, and That critique was considered in volume 2 of the Marina Coast I'm going to get my acronyms mixed up here, of the Marina Groundwater Sustainability Plan, in the questions and responses to comments, and it was reviewed in our responses to comments that are documented in the GSP.
So you did no direct review of the critique, only reviewed the discussion of it that was already in the Marina prepared document?
That's not entirely correct. So our review done back in 2019 was embodied in the GSP. Excuse me, that was 2018 was embodied in the GSP. And we did look at a subsequent critique that was published in 2019 as well. So there were several documents by HWG that were embodied in our responses to comments, and we did have those. And to refresh our memories, or my memory, I looked at those at the 2019 HWG document.
You did not review any submittals to the AHO regarding their review of that AEM work, correct?
No.
Nor did you review their testimony, either direct or cross-examination, correct?
In this proceeding?
Correct.
No.
Okay. Okay. I take it you're unaware of the AHO's. Well, we'll get back to that. Okay. So you had your retention in sometime in June. You requested materials. You obviously reviewed them. And when is the date that you were prepared to report for Mr. Spalding and his team?
Oh gosh. So there's been a lot of recent activity, and so I have to go back to what the date of my testimony was. If you bear with me for just a moment, I can look that up.
So your filing was on August 30, but presumably you finished before then.
Well, it actually was just very shortly before the filing that we finished. Everything was fairly compressed. So it was during August that we prepared my written testimony, and then followed up with the slide deck.
So between your written testimony and your engagement in June, did you produce any interim or draft reports?
So my testimony was it went through a couple of different drafts that were updated on a share site internally with our team, and that was shared with council.
And when was the first draft date? That's all I'm looking for at the moment.
Well, it was a collaborative document, so there weren't like specific cutoff dates. It was updated online as we went. So I would have to go back through my records to see exactly when it was, but I think it would have been in mid-August would be. So I'm if it's important for you to know exact dates, I would need to go back. I can't tell you the exact dates with 100% certainty. I'm just giving you, as I sit here, my best recollections. And if that's good enough for this testimony, then you just need to be aware of that. If you want precise dates, I would have to go back and get them for you.
Are you pretty confident it was in August and not July?
To be honest, I've had a number of matters that I've been working on recently that have all kind of converged on this time frame. I'm pretty confident that it was in August.
Thank you. Now, there's two parts, I think, to your task, although you may not have described them quite like I'm about to, so you can correct me. But one was a review and critique of the swim, and the other was a review and critique of Mr. Leffler's modifications to the swim. Is that correct?
That is correct, with the caveat that we were asked to review the swim by the city, not under council, as part of our responsibilities to represent them on the GTAC. And so we had reviewed the swim prior to this engagement. And that work started, I'm sorry, that work started in earlier this year.
And you had a pretty complete review and critique of the swim by the time you were engaged in June, correct?
That's correct. This work advanced that review and made it more systematic, because obviously the standard of care and the support needed to support this kind of proceeding differs from what's necessary to provide technical advisory committee comments to a GSA.
I want to detour for just a minute to make sure I understand your comments. And the detour is you have quite a number of matters that you're working on, and it's hard to sort of keep things straight. So how many matters are you working on at the moment?
When you're referring to matters, I assume you're referring to legal cases?
No, I was just trying to repeat what you said. Maybe I didn't correctly, but maybe I'll ask it this way to help you out. If your work is 100%, how much of your time, what percentage of your time was devoted in August to reviewing the swim and the Mr. Leffler modifications?
I'm going to say, and again, I could refer to time records if you wanted a precise number, but I would have to say maybe about 30% of my time.
Okay. And if you can give us a rough estimate, my question recognizes you don't have your time records, about what would that total hours be, what range for 30% of your time?
Recognizing that I work both professionally and as a hobby, I would say I've probably spent, are you asking how many hours have I spent preparing this testimony? Is that your question, or?
Well, I wasn't limiting it to the testimony, but how many hours you spent roughly in August on the task that you were undertaking for this proceeding?
I would say probably on the order of 100 hours.
And that was 30% of your time?
Well, let's see, we're looking at 4 weeks.
It's a 300-hour month.
Yeah, it was a busy month. So maybe 80 to 100 hours might be more accurate.
Thank you. So now turning to your qualifications, you have summarized them on one sort of bullet point page in your slide deck. You have some discussion of them in your testimony, and then you have as Exhibit 63, City or Marina Exhibit 63, your statement of qualifications. That's the three places we have your education and work experience, correct?
Yes.
And is it correct that Exhibit 63 is your formation environmental bio that is available through them, not tailored to this proceeding? If you want to see it, I'm going to want to go through it anyway. So just a note to Ms. Mullen, we're going to pull that up in a second.
I did update it specifically for this proceeding, but it includes a lot of information, primarily information that is in my normal standard CV for the company.
Okay, thank you. It's more detailed than the slide summary, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And even more detailed than the testimony summary, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so why don't we start with that since it's more exhaustive, and we'll walk through that together a little bit.
Sure. Sorry, are you waiting for me or okay?
No, thank you. This is, we all want to be helpful, but none of us want to be impatient when someone's working hard to help. So it's a little difficult to know, Mr. Tizzo, when we should ask if they heard us, et cetera. But
Yeah, I don't know. And I wasn't being impatient. I just didn't want to not do something I was supposed to.
Thank you. So we see the top of Marina 63. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Actually, let me pause. I forgot to ask you something really fundamental. And my recollection is that when you were introduced, Mr. Spalding asked you if exhibits 60, Marina exhibits 62, 65 and 68 reflected your opinion for this matter. Do you remember that?
Actually, perhaps Mr. Osias, I could correct it. I think it was 62, 63. I said 64 and 68. 64 should have been 65. So.
Okay, but 63 is just his bio, so that really doesn't reflect his opinion. That's the only reason I left it out. But that's fine. If you asked him, I'm just repeating you. So do you remember when Mr. Spalding asked you about 62, 63, 64, 65, 68, and whether it reflected your opinion?
That's correct. And I understood him to be asking me about my written testimony, the figures, and the presentation slides. Those were the three exhibits that contain my opinion. Yes.
But he didn't ask you if you wrote them. So no, I'm going to ask you that. Did you write exhibit 62?
Yes, I did.
The testimony?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All by yourself?
I had some help from my team in writing certain sections or in making edits, and we collaborated on putting it together. And I did most of the work on it myself. So I was the principal author and took responsibility for it.
And is that the same answer for exhibit 65?
65 are the figures, I believe.
Correct.
Those were put together by my team and approved by me. So those were put together under my direction.
Okay, and the slide deck 68, did you author all those slides?
I was again the primary author of the slide deck, and then there were some changes made on review.
Changes made by you or someone
By
else?
my team.
By your team. And when you say your team, you're not referring to your council, you're referring to the people you already identified.
I'm referring to the people that I identified, yes.
Okay, thank you. That hadn't gotten into the record. I wanted to ask you that. So let's go to your bio now. If we could go to page 2. And maybe scroll out just so we can see this entire paragraph of experience summary. I take it you're relatively familiar with what you have in this paragraph, correct?
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you questions as we go through your bio. And if you need to pause to reread it to refresh your recollection, feel free.
Okay.
But this summary of experience contains no mention of modeling, correct?
No, I don't believe it does.
Okay, so that sounds like a yes. It's correct that it does not contain any mention of modeling.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. And then one of the changes maybe you made to this exhibit 63 is to move the representative experience for the city of Marina higher up the list because it's more relevant to what we're doing here. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. In your normal bio, it would sit somewhere else.
It would sit, somewhere else, somewhere lower.
Okay. If we can scroll down to the next paragraph. Do you see the sentence, the city is reliant exclusively on groundwater? This is just a locational cue. I just want you to look at that sentence for a minute.
Yes.
The city has no water rights, correct?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
It's my understanding that the city is supplied water by Marina Coast Water District, and that they hold the appropriative rights to supply that water.
Thank you. And you're not answering that question as a lawyer, you're answering it as a senior hydrogeologist, correct?
Yes, as a senior hydrogeologist who understands the water supply for the city.
Okay. And is the city in the 180-400 subbasin, or is it in the Monterey subbasin?
180-400. Well, let me revise that. It's split between the two. The city limits are.
Okay. So the reason you didn't mention the Monterey subbasin in that sentence?
Well, you didn't ask it.
No, I'm just reading your description of your work, and you describe who the city is.
I thought you meant in my answer. My apologies.
No. I'm still just stuck on that second sentence there.
Is there a reason why I didn't mention it? I suppose because my work focused on the portion of the city that's located within the 180-400 subbasin.
Okay. Now you're aware that the city attempted to become a GSA for an area of groundwater, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And you actually, it sounds like, prepared a draft, or maybe not draft, groundwater sustainability plan for the city in connection with that effort, correct?
So clarify the question in terms of draft versus not draft, and I can answer it.
Okay. The city was not approved by the Department of Water Resources as a GSA, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And the groundwater sustainability plan, therefore, was not approved by the Department of Water Resources as an official groundwater sustainability plan, correct?
So let me answer the question now. So the groundwater sustainability plan was duly adopted following Sigma required procedures by the city and submitted to the DWR. My understanding is that that's currently being litigated and that the city has received, and when I say the city, I also mean the GSA, has received a letter from the DWR saying that pending the results of those of that litigation and whether or not the plan is duly accepted, then it would be duly processed as the effective GSP for the area. So that's pending, hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so at least while litigation is pending, that's not an official GSP, correct?
Not official in the sense that it is not, has not been accepted by the DWR, and it's not being implemented or reported on to the DWR.
Nor yet reviewed by the DWR, correct?
I am unaware to the extent to which the DWR has looked at it. What I was made aware of is that any kind of official review was being set aside pending a finding of whether or not that that GSP has standing to be reviewed.
And then you referenced litigation, so that litigation is a lawsuit that was brought by the city seeking to become a GSA, correct?
I actually don't have a lot of detailed knowledge regarding that particular lawsuit, but my understanding is that it involves the city standing as a GSA and the GSP standing as a legitimate GSP for the MGSA portion of the subbasin.
And do you understand that the city lost in the trial court?
Yes, I heard that this is under appeal.
Appeal by the city for losing, correct?
That's my understanding. I mean, that's why an appeal happens.
Well, okay, since you didn't identify, okay.
Okay,
And
yeah, my apologies. I don't mean to be flip.
no, that's okay. Nor do I, although sometimes it's hard to tell. In the meantime, there is a GSA and a GSP that covers this geographic area, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is that called the 180-400 GSA or something like that?
It's the Salinas Valley Groundwater Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency, that we like long acronyms, SVB-GSA, and they have adopted a GSP for the 180-400 subbasin. That's correct.
Okay. And that sort of relates to what we're about to get to, because it's that GSA that engaged Montgomery and Associates for a variable density model.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. At least on this paragraph so far, and its description, there's no mention of modeling work, correct?
At least as I see it on this page, there's not. I don't think there is.
If we want to go to the next page.
Something perhaps that just because there's no mention doesn't mean that a model is not used as a tool. That's a routine thing in my business.
Understood.
Okay.
And we can go to the next page. Part of this exercise to understand your experience is to understand your personal experience as the witness in connection with models.
I understand.
Okay, so I'll move away from the bio for 1 minute, because to speed this along a little bit, there are times when you have used the word review or led an effort, and it involved modeling. Okay, but that doesn't actually mean you were the modeler, correct?
That's correct. Sometimes I was, and sometimes I wasn't. For very intensive modeling efforts, I usually rely on designated experts, and they work under my direction and review, and I stamp the reports. For some projects, I will build a model and run it myself. But usually for the more intensive efforts, I'll rely on a team of people to do that for me.
Okay, so on this upper paragraph on page 3, where you finish a fairly lengthy description of all the work you're doing for the city, there's no mention of modeling, correct?
No.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Are you complete?
Our modeling work for the city has been limited to reviewing existing models by others. And that was, that started with my earlier engagement and for the GSP, as well as now under the GTAC and the what was called the SWIG TAC, the Seawater Intrusion Group TAC.
Speaking of is it the GTAC, or did you say some other acronym?
Okay, there was the SWIG TAC. You can see it, I think, 5 lines up from the bottom. Initially, there was a Seawater Intrusion Group that was set up by the SVB GSA. That was called the SWIG TAC. The SWIG, and they had a technical advisory committee that I was a part of. And then that disbanded to a more general, they found they wanted a more general technical advisory group. So they have the GTAC, or the Groundwater Technical Advisory Group.
And you're an alternate on the GTAC, correct?
At this point, I'm primary. Initially on the SWIG TAC, I was primary as well. And then I assigned a deputy to be the primary for a period of time, and worked very closely with him, and he worked under my direction.
So you're not currently the alternate?
I believe I'm currently the primary. At least that was the intent. Now, whether or not they put me in as that, I'm not, so let me maybe explain. So I started as the primary for the SWIG TAC. I worked very closely with a hydrogeologist named Stephen Carlton. Then I designated him as the primary, and I became the alternate. Mr. Carlton retired, and I brought Pete Townsend on as the replacement alternate. But to my understanding, I'm currently the primary. And to the city's understanding, I was always the one with the primary responsibility for representing the city, or for representation of the city on the technical advisory groups.
Okay. If we can scroll down. In this bio that you have, which is many pages long, and that you reorganized a little bit for this proceeding, there's no mention of modeling in that second, I shouldn't say second, in the heading under review of draft groundwater sustainability plans.
There was no explicit modeling involved in that, except to the extent that when we reviewed GSPs that based some of their sustainable management criteria and some of their analysis on models. So peripherally, there was modeling involved in the review, but no explicit looking and critique of models in that particular scope of work.
So reviewing a model could mean a lot of different things. So let me start specifically, because there's a few entries here where you mention it, although not very many. To review a model, do you open, and if I'm using really like silly vocabulary, you can just correct it in your answer, but do you open model files and look at the model?
Typically, so it depends on the assignment, of course. Usually what I will do if I'm being asked to review a model is go back to the basics, start out with what's known, how is the model constructed, what's the concept, what are the questions that are needing to be answered, and then either I or somebody else will typically open the model to see how the model was constructed and whether or not it's consistent with those objectives. And that may or may not involve actual test runs of the model or just post-processing and extracting data from the model to see how it's built and what it does, how it performs.
So in connection with the SWIM, if I can use that acronym.
Yes.
Which work started well before this assignment for the AHO proceeding. Did you open that model personally, or did you have someone else do it?
I had someone else do it.
And they provided you a report?
They provided me a summary.
And did you rely on that summary for the critique that's included in this AHO proceeding?
Yes, I did.
Was that Mr. Townsend?
That was Mr. Townsend, and I'm trying to remember if the initial work was Mr. Townsend. We also conferred with EKI in their capacity on the GTAC and their review of that particular model.
And you relied on that as well?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, if you have a team that can open up a model, look at the model files, I presume they're also capable of changing the model. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if you wanted to test something about the model, test might not be the right word. If you wanted to evaluate something about the model, one of the ways you can do that is to change it, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How many models have you personally constructed?
Personally, I'd have to say probably about 20.
Are you finished?
Yeah.
Okay, that's over your career?
That's over my career, yes.
Okay. How many were variable density models?
None of them were.
So you've never constructed a variable density model?
No.
In the task for this proceeding, since you already had your team's review of the SWIM and Ms. Nelson's team's review of the SWIM, was the focus primarily to see how Mr. Loeffler's adjustments changed the SWIM?
That was part of it. We did extract information from the model to see how the model was changed from the SWIM, and we looked at Mr. Loeffler's report